Absalom and King David. The story. Tamar, Absalom's sister, fled to Absalom's home after their half-brother Amnon abused her. This started when Amnon lured Tamar to his home, pretending to be ill and wanting her to prepare him a meal, even though Amnon just wanted to take advantage of her. Absalom hated Amnon and wouldn't speak to him following this. David was furious and hurt by the tragedy. 2 years later, and still disgusted by Amnon's actions, Absalom assembled a large crowd of his servants to confront Amnon about the sin he had committed against Tamar. However, he masked this ambush under the facade of a feast. Absalom asked his father David's permission to let Amnon and all his half-brothers attend the party. David was hesitant to allow his son to go, but eventually did and blessed Absalom before he left. When Amnon was drunk at the feast, Absalom's servants killed him on their master's command, and Absalom fled to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur, staying in Geshur for 3 years. David mourned the loss of both his sons, but more for Absalom, because he was alive, and David wanted him to return home. King David's commander and nephew, Joab, seeing David's pain and yearning for Absalom's return after being exiled for killing Amnon, constructed a plan to reconcile the king and his son. Joab presented a woman from Tekoa, a city in Judah about 12 miles, 19.3 kilometers south of Jerusalem, with a story of a family tragedy that remarkably echoed the situation between Absalom, Amnon, and David. The similarities weren't a coincidence, as this woman's story was fake and all part of Joab's plan. It worked. Absalom returned to Jerusalem and reconnected with David, his father. However, after returning to his father, Absalom started a rebellion against David to overthrow him and take Israel's kingship for himself. During a 4-year period, Absalom quietly assembled the support of Israel by appearing sympathetic and humble, and sent spies throughout Israel to help further his plot. Then Absalom with his followers headed for Hebron to claim the kingship from his father. David, with his closest and most loyal followers, fled with the Ark of the Covenant, leaving some of his concubines behind to hold Absalom and his troops off. Like when King Saul pursued him, David travelled throughout Israel as Absalom followed, and David prayed to God for his protection and guidance throughout this ordeal. At one point on his escape, David met Ziba, the servant of a rich man named Mephibosheth, who provided David with a couple of saddled donkeys and a massive collection of supplies, including 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. Yet Ziba's gesture wasn't as generous as it seemed, because Ziba used it to falsely accuse his master, Mephibosheth, of siding with Absalom during this conflict, causing David to transfer all Mephibosheth's possessions to him. Also during David's escape, David was publicly insulted and cursed out by a man named Shimei in Baram, who was a relative of King Saul. Shimei took advantage of David's vulnerability while under stress from the situation with Absalom, and unleashed his frustrations on David for his past actions against Saul's family. David didn't engage with Shimei and ignored him. Absalom and his followers arrived in Jerusalem and were met by David's advisor, Hushai. Hushai was extremely loyal to David, so pretended to show allegiance to Absalom, but it doesn't entirely work because Absalom is suspicious, yet isn't fully unconvinced. Owing to this, Absalom seeks guidance from Ahithophel, who advises Absalom to have relations with David's concubines to solidify his authority as Israel's king, and to shame David in front of his followers. Absalom did as Ahithophel suggests. Afterward, Absalom sought the counsel of both Ahithophel and Hushai, who both suggested that Absalom attack David while he was at his weakest, with Ahithophel advising Absalom to bring an army of 12,000 men to kill him quickly, and Hushai suggests Absalom bring a larger and more prepared one. Absalom chooses Hushai's plan. Hushai, still loyal to David, proposed his plan because he believed it would delay Absalom's attack, allowing David to escape and end Absalom's rebellion. Following Hushai confirming the plan with Absalom, Hushai immediately reports the important parts of the plan to the priests Zadok and Abiathar. Zadok and Abiathar echo Hushai's words to Jonathan and Aramaz, who were staying at En-Rogel. Together with a maidservant, the three went to warn David but were spotted by Absalom, so hid in a well until it was safe. When the three were sure Absalom was gone, they left and reported to David, who was camped at the Jordan River, Hushai's message. David and his troops flee across the Jordan and head for Maranamah. When Ahithophel saw his plan failed, he left by donkey and hung himself, while Absalom pursued David across the Jordan and set Amasa over his army and camped at Gilead. King David knew war with Absalom was coming, so assembled his men and separated them into 3 groups. 1/3 was commanded by David's loyal and long-term commander Joab, another third by Joab's brother Abishai, and the last by Ittai the Gittites. And David instructed them not to kill Absalom but spare him and take him captive. The war between David's men and Israel began in the forest of Ephraim, and David's men slaughtered 20,000 Israelite men. King David's men discovered Absalom while he was riding his mule under a great oak tree. Somehow Absalom's head became stuck in the oak and was left hanging, but he was not hurt or dead. One of David's men saw it and told Joab. Joab asked him why he didn't kill him, offering him 10 pieces of silver, and the man replied he wouldn't kill the king's son. So Joab took 3 spears and struck Absalom, and 10 of Joab's armor-bearers finished him off, and Joab blew the trumpet to signify victory. David mourned deeply for Absalom when he heard of his son's death. After a while, Joab convinced David to return to his kingly duties, officially ending Absalom's rebellion against David. Digging deeper. We'll begin this section by investigating the similarities between the conflicts of Absalom and David and that of King Saul and David. Both stories share many things in common, and it's not just David's involvement. The first is David started off having a positive relationship with both Saul and Absalom. David calmed Saul with his harp, helped the Israelites defeat the Philistines after he beheaded Goliath, and had a close relationship with Saul's children, Michal and Jonathan. And Absalom was David's son, with Absalom being David's favourite. The second is both Absalom and Saul pursued David throughout Israel during the conflict. The difference is Saul's lasted 8 years, while Absalom's 3. Lastly, both Saul and Absalom's conflict ended with their deaths. Interestingly, both were killed after someone refused to take them out. Saul by his armor-bearer, who initially wouldn't, but did after Saul persuaded him to. Absalom was murdered by David's commander Joab and 10 of his armor-bearers. Another link, after the young man who discovered him refused. 3 connections between Absalom and King Saul aren't linked to their conflict with David. The first is their appearance. Both are described as the most handsome men in Israel. Saul in 1 Samuel 9:2 and Absalom in 2 Samuel 14:25. The second is both men are the father of 3 sons. Absalom's sons are not named and potentially died during their childhood, because 2 Samuel 18:18 states, "I have no son to preserve my name," which was written on a commemorative pillar Absalom set up for himself before his death. And Saul's sons were Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchi-Suah. The third is both erected monuments to celebrate their lives. Absalom's was mentioned before and is found in 2 Samuel 18:18, and Saul's is recorded in 1 Samuel 15 verse 12. Saul's creation was produced after he was scolded by Samuel for disobeying God following Israel's battle with the Amalekites. His Saul spared the Amalekite king Agag and the people's best livestock. This is also when Samuel announced God's rejection of Saul as king, possibly the reason Saul set this memorial because his kingship was over. Finally, David mourned deeply for the loss of both Absalom and Saul, grieving for the loss of Israel's king and the loss of his son. We'll finish by exploring the similarities between the conflicts of Absalom and David and Esau and Jacob. These likenesses are weak, but still interesting. The main players are related. Absalom is David's son and Jacob is Esau's twin brother, and one relative tried to defraud the other. Absalom unsuccessfully tried to steal David's kingship, and Jacob successfully stole Esau's birthright. The differences are Esau didn't pursue Jacob while Absalom did David. David didn't instigate anything with Absalom while Jacob did Esau. And Absalom's conflict with David did not involve a direct third person, while Jacob and Esau's did, with Isaac involved in their situation. As stated, the connections between these two stories are weak, but they are there if you look. What to learn? What should we take away from the conflict between Absalom and David? I believe it teaches us the dangers of arrogance and pride, and the consequences that can occur from displaying this attitude. Absalom initially showed his heart was after God when he expressed disgust at Amnon's actions towards his sister Tamar. Yet this all changed when Absalom took matters into his own hands by killing Amnon for his crime, instead of waiting for David and God to punish him for the crime. This continued with Absalom starting a coup against his father David for Israel's kingship, instead of waiting for David to pass it on naturally. Absalom would have achieved all he wanted, justice for his sister and becoming Israel's king, if he waited for God to act instead of trying to control things himself. God would have punished Amnon for his crime, as it was against the law of Moses, Leviticus 18 verse 6 and 9. Although this punishment is unknown, it was up to God, not Absalom, to decide. Since David's oldest Amnon was dead, and his second, Cheleb or Daniel, is Pharaoh's to have passed young, most likely before the conflict between David and Absalom, Absalom would have become king after David died. Yet Absalom's impatience caused his death, and David's son Solomon took the crown when their father passed instead of him. How does this apply to us today? Like Absalom, we need to ensure we don't get ahead of ourselves and remember that God is in charge, not us. We should trust that God will make all things right. We may believe God is allowing injustice to succeed, like Absalom did with the tragedy between Amnon and Tamar, but God loves justice and in the end will right all wrongs. We should always be patient and know that God sees our wants and needs. We may believe God is failing us when we don't see things going our way, as Absalom did with Israel's kingship, but God knows what's best and will provide all things in His time, and this is what is right for our life. To conclude, be patient and trust God. Let Him take care of the big things, and us the small things.